October 12, 1933. The wind that swept down from the northern peaks over Prosperity Creek was not the familiar, blustering guest of autumn. It was a different entity altogether. A thin, sharp thing that carried the scent of deep ice and an unnerving stillness in its wake. It stripped the aspen groves of their gold in a single, merciless afternoon and left the branches clawing at a sky the color of old pewter. The squirrels, usually a frantic, chattering nuisance, had vanished, their caches long since sealed. The deer had already descended from the high country, their coats thick and their eyes wide with an ancient apprehension. Silas Blackwood watched it all from the porch of his small, drafty cabin, the one that held too many memories of his late wife, Martha, and the rasp of her final, pneumonia-racked breaths from the winter before. He felt the coming cold not in his bones, but in the hollow space her absence had left, a space he had vowed to never let the frost fill again. While the other men in town were putting up their storm windows and splitting a final cord of wood, trusting in the familiar rhythm of the seasons, Silas was engaged in a far stranger ritual. For weeks, he had been using his old mule, Beatrice, to haul load after load of curved, corrugated steel sheets up the treacherous path to the abandoned sterling silver mine, a dark maw in the side of the mountain that had been silent for 2 decades. The work was brutal, each sheet a stubborn, unwieldy beast that fought him with every step. His hands, already calloused from a life of hard labor, were raw and bleeding, but his movements were fueled by a quiet, unyielding resolve that the townsfolk mistook for madness. They saw the widower, lost in his grief, hauling scrap metal to a forgotten hole in the ground. Silas saw the steel ribs of an ark. He saw a fortress against the coming predator, a place where the wind's sharp teeth could not bite, where the deep, killing cold could not reach. He was not burying himself in his sorrow. He was forging a sanctuary from it, piece by agonizing piece. The talk in Abernathy's general store, the lukewarm heart of Prosperity Creek, had turned from crop prices and federal relief programs to the peculiar activities of Silas Blackwood. Mr. Abernathy himself, a man whose girth was matched only by his certainty, held court from behind a counter stacked high with bolts of flannel and tins of coffee. He polished a pair of spectacles with a clean corner of his apron, a smirk playing on his lips. Heard the latest on old Silas? He'd ask anyone who came within earshot, his voice a low, conspiratorial rumble. Hauling tin up to the sterling. Thinks he's a groundhog going to sleep the winter away in a burrow. A smattering of laughter would follow, weak and uncertain at first, then growing bolder as others chimed in. Lost his senses when he lost Martha. One would say, shaking his head with performative pity. Grief does strange things to a man. Another would add, tapping his temple. They spoke of him as a ghost, a man already lost to the world of reason. Their scorn was a comfortable blanket they pulled around themselves, a way to reinforce their own normalcy, their own belief that the world would continue as it always had. They could not comprehend the quiet terror that drove Silas, the memory that was a brand on his soul. He still heard it in the silence of the night, the thin, shallow cough that had started in November, the rattling in Martha's chest by January, the awful finality of the silence in February. He remembered the uselessness of the extra blankets, the way the wind found every crack in their cabins chinking, the icy drafts that slithered across the floor like snakes. He remembered the doctor, helpless and apologetic, saying, "It's the cold, Silas. Her lungs just can't fight it." That memory was the architect of his current obsession. As he stood at the mouth of the Sterling mine, the cold air breathing out from its depths, he wasn't just clearing rock and debris. He was clearing away the ghosts of his own failure, battling the specter of his own helplessness. Each swing of the pickaxe was a blow against the winter that had stolen his world. The town saw a man retreating from life, but Silas was in a fight for it, a fight they couldn't yet see was their own. The interior of the mine was a cavern, a geological womb that promised stable, subterranean temperatures. The air was still and held the clean, mineral scent of deep earth. Here, Silas began the meticulous process of construction. First, he spent a week leveling a 30-foot section of the cavern floor, using a line level, shovels, and a heavy iron tamper. It was back-breaking, monotonous work, performed by the flickering golden light of a single kerosene lantern that threw his hulking shadow against the stone walls. Once the ground was perfectly flat, he laid a foundation not of wood, which would rot in the damp, but of flat, carefully selected river stones. Over this, he unrolled thick sheets of tar paper, overlapping them and sealing the seams with a bucket of hot pitch that filled the cavern with its acrid smell. This was his barrier against the deep, seeping damp of the earth. Only then did he begin to assemble the structure itself. He bolted the first curved steel rib to the next, the sharp clang of his wrench echoing in the profound silence. Working alone, he devised a simple lever and pulley system using an old beam wedged into the rock ceiling to hoist the heavy, awkward arches into place. It was a slow, deliberate dance of muscle, mechanics, and sheer will. Day after day, the silver arch grew, a strange metallic skeleton taking shape within the stone. He was not merely building a shelter, he was engineering a pocket of survival. He understood what the others had forgotten. The earth itself was a blanket. Below the frost line, the ground held a constant, steady temperature, a gentle warmth that was the antithesis of the howling gales on the surface. His Quonset, insulated by the very mountain that housed it, would not fight the cold. It would ignore it. The town saw him hauling tin. They didn't see him calculating airflow, considering thermal mass, and planning for a winter they refused to believe was coming. His project was a testament to the quiet, potent wisdom of foresight, a wisdom born from the harshest of lessons. The clang of his hammer on steel was a lonely sound, a prayer for a future no one else could envision. With the shell of the Quonset complete, a silver tunnel nestled securely within its stone cocoon, Silas turned his attention to provisioning. This was not an act of frantic hoarding but a calm, methodical curation of life. He stacked sacks of flour, pinto beans, and oats against one wall, their burlap sides printed with the names of mills 1,000 miles away. He hung thick slabs of salted pork from the steel rafters, each one wrapped in cheesecloth. On sturdy shelves he built from salvaged planks, he arranged the last of Martha's legacy. Rows of mason jars filled with green beans, pickled beets, and jewel-toned raspberry jam, each one a small sun against the coming darkness. Crates of potatoes, onions, and winter squash filled the remaining space, their earthy scent mingling with the smell of metal and stone. His most ingenious creation, however, was his heating and ventilation system. He installed a small, pot-bellied stove near the back of the hut, but instead of running the stovepipe directly out, he engineered a long, circuitous route. The pipe snaked along the length of the Quonset, then doubled back on itself before finally exiting through a small, drilled hole near the mine's entrance. This design was a work of practical genius. The extended pipe acted as a massive radiator, transferring the stove's heat not only to the air inside the hut but also to the surrounding rock walls, slowly warming the entire cavern and turning it into a thermal battery. A second, smaller pipe, positioned low to the ground, drew in a steady, slow stream of fresh, cold air from outside, which was then warmed as it passed the stove, ensuring constant circulation without creating a draft. It was a closed, self-sustaining system of warmth and air. As he worked, the first snows of the season began to fall, weeks earlier than the oldest almanacs predicted. It was a light, dry powder that hissed against the ground and clung to the north side of the pines. In town, they called it a squall, a fluke. But Silas, watching the flakes swirl at the mine's entrance, knew it was a warning. The predator was stalking the edges of the valley, and he was sealing the final locks on his ark. The last time Silas went to town, the air had a new, crystalline sharpness to it, and the sky was a hard, unforgiving blue. He was there for salt, kerosene, and coffee, the final items on his exhaustive list. As he loaded his supplies onto Beatrice's back, Mr. Abernathy stepped out from the store, wiping his hands on his apron, his expression a mixture of pity and condescension. "Silas," he began, his voice softer than it was when he spoke of him to others. "Folks are getting worried. We've had a mild few years, but this is no country to be spending a winter in a hole in the ground. A man belongs in a proper house, not a burrow." The word hung in the air, the same one he used for mockery, now cloaked in false concern. Silas finished tying the last knot on the mule's pack and turned to face him. He looked at Abernathy's well-fed frame, his clean apron, his comfortable certainty. He saw a man who had never been truly cold, never been truly helpless. "A proper house is a warm one, Mr. Abernathy," Silas said, his voice quiet but as solid as the mountain behind him. "And I plan on being warm." He offered no further explanation. There was no point. He tipped his hat, a gesture of finality, and led Beatrice away, leaving the storekeeper standing on the boardwalk, shaking his head. Back at the mine, Silas moved the last of his world inside. He carried in Martha's old rocking chair and placed it near the stove. He hung their wedding photograph on a nail he'd driven between two steel panels. He arranged his father's well-worn tools on a small workbench. These were not just objects. They were anchors to his past and talismans for his future. The Quonset was no longer a shell of metal. It was a home. That night it began. The wind did not rise. It fell upon the valley like a judgment. A low moan escalated into a full-throated, shrieking roar that sounded like the world tearing apart. The temperature, which had been hovering just below freezing, plummeted 20, then 30, then 40 degrees in a matter of hours. Snow began to fall, not in flakes, but in a solid, blinding wall of white. How often do we dismiss the quiet work of others, mistaking their diligence for delusion, only to later wish we had understood their wisdom? It is a timeless question, one that every generation must answer for itself, often when the storm is already at the door. Inside his shelter, Silas lit his lantern and stoked the fire in his small stove. The wind howled a world away, its fury unable to penetrate the deep silence of the earth. He was warm. He was safe. The vindication had begun. For 3 days, the world outside was a churning vortex of white. The blizzard was not a storm but a siege, laying waste to the valley with an indifferent and absolute power. In Prosperity Creek, the initial novelty of being snowed curdled quickly into a raw, gnawing fear. The wind, a physical force, tore shingles from roofs and shattered the windows of the church. Snow drifted higher than doorways, transforming familiar lanes into impassable canyons of white and sealing families inside their homes, which were rapidly becoming iceboxes. Woodpiles, foolishly left uncovered, were buried under 10 feet of snow. The thin walls of the cabins, never intended for such a sustained assault, offered little more than psychological comfort against a cold so profound it felt like a presence, an intruder that leached the warmth from a man's very blood. While his neighbors huddled around sputtering fires, feeding them precious furniture to stay alive, Silas Blackwood lived in a different reality. His world was one of quiet routine and steady, enveloping warmth. The roar of the blizzard at the mouth of the Sterling mine was a distant, muffled complaint, the anger of a predator locked outside the gates. Inside the Quonset, the temperature held at a constant 60 degrees. The air was dry and still, smelling faintly of baking bread and hot coffee. By the light of his kerosene lantern, he would read from one of the few books he owned, check the seals on Martha's jars, and meticulously log his consumption of supplies in a small ledger. He ate his meals of salt pork and beans at a small table, the silence broken only by the gentle hiss of the lantern and the soft crackle from the pot-bellied stove. He was utterly alone, yet he was not lonely. He was the captain of a ship sailing through a tempest, secure in the knowledge that every bolt was tightened, every provision accounted for. The world outside had ceased to exist, and in its place was only the deep, resonant peace of the earth and the quiet triumph of a plan made whole. He was a man living underground, but for the first time in a year, he felt he could finally breathe. A month crawled by. The blizzard did not break. It merely paused for breath, its lulls lasting just long enough to reveal the scale of the devastation before the next wave of white fury descended. Hope in Prosperity Creek had become a currency more precious and scarcer than food. The town's collective stores were gone. Mr. Abernathy's shelves were bare, stripped not only by desperate townsfolk but by his own short-sightedness. He had kept only enough stock for a typical winter, scoffing at the notion of needing more. Now, his certainty had evaporated, replaced by the hollow-eyed dread of a man who sees the consequences of his pride written on the gaunt faces of his neighbors. He sat in his cold, dark store, listening to the pleas of people he could no longer help, the weight of their suffering a physical burden on his shoulders. Sickness, born of cold and hunger, began to move through the town. It started with a cough in one cabin, a fever in another, spreading with the silent, insidious efficiency of the frost itself. The doctor's meager supply of medicine was exhausted in the first week. People began to speak of Silas Blackwood again. The name was no longer a punchline but a whisper, a fragile, half-formed question mark in the freezing air. He was preparing for something, a young mother, Clara, said, her voice thin as she tried to warm a broth for her shivering child. He was hauling things up to the old Sterling all-autumn Abernathy. Overhearing her, could only grunt in response, the memory of his own smug pronouncements a bitter ash in his mouth. The mockery had died, and in its place grew a terrifying thought. What if the madman had been the only sane one among them? What if the burrow he had dug for himself was the only safe place left in a world that had frozen over? The possibility was too immense, too damning to consider fully, yet it lingered, a tiny, defiant ember in the encroaching dark. The breaking point came on a Tuesday, in the 6th week of the siege. It was the day Clara's son, young Thomas, stopped shivering. His small body, having exhausted its last reserves fighting the cold that had invaded their home, had grown still, his breathing shallow and frighteningly faint. A desperate, primal fear seized Clara and her husband, Ben. They knew the boy would not last another night in their cabin, where the temperature was now well below freezing. There was only one option, a wild gamble born of utter despair. Ben, his face a grim mask of determination, bundled the boy in every blanket they owned. He looked at the half-dozen other men huddled in his cabin, their faces etched with the same desperation. "I'm going up to the Sterling," he announced, his voice cracking. "I don't know what's up there. Maybe nothing. Maybe he's dead. But we're dead if we stay here." A silence fell over the room, the weight of his words settling on them all. Then, one by one, 2 other men stood up. They would go with him. The journey was a vision of hell rendered in white. The wind was a physical blade, flaying any exposed skin. The snow was a treacherous, shifting ocean, chest-deep in places, hiding rocks and fallen logs beneath its surface. They had no trail to follow, only Ben's memory of the old miner's path and the grim outline of the mountain against the gray, churning sky. They fell, they cursed, they rose again, driven by the small, precious weight of the child in Ben's arms. After 2 hours that felt like a lifetime, they saw it. It was almost invisible, a faint, gray plume of smoke ghosting from a small pipe jutting out of a snow-covered rock face. It was a sign of life, of fire, of warmth. Hope, fierce and painful, surged through Ben's frozen limbs. They stumbled the last 50 yards, collapsing against the rock wall at the mine's entrance, a dark opening nearly sealed by a massive snowdrift. "Silas!" Ben roared, his voice raw. "Silas Blackwood! For the love of God! Help us!" The sound that reached Silas was faint, distorted by the wind and the tons of rock that separated him from the surface world. At first, he thought it was a trick of the wind, another voice in the storm's endless symphony. But then he heard it again, clearer this time, a raw cry of human desperation. He set down his book, his heart pounding a sudden, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He grabbed his lantern and made his way to the front of the Quonset, to the heavy, insulated door he had built. He pulled back the thick iron bolts and heaved it open. A blast of Arctic air and swirling snow roared into the cavern, a shocking intrusion into his climate-controlled world. Framed in the opening, half buried in the snowdrift, were 3 figures, their faces caked in ice, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. Ben, holding the small bundle, stared past Silas into the shelter. What he saw must have seemed like a mirage. He saw the steady, golden glow of lanterns, the dark, reassuring shape of the pot-bellied stove radiating a visible shimmer of heat. He smelled the impossible sense of warm metal, coffee, and something else, something life-affirming and rich, fresh bread. Silas wasted no time on questions. He saw the child, the desperation. "Get inside," he commanded, his voice a low rumble. He helped them through the snow, pulling them into the antechamber of the mine, and then through the door into the Quonset itself. The wave of 60-degree heat that washed over them was so profound it was painful, a shock to their frozen bodies. Ben gently laid Thomas down on Silas's own cot near the stove. We didn't know," Ben stammered, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. "We all said. We thought you were crazy." Silas simply looked at the pale, still face of the boy and then back at the men. He handed Ben a tin mug of hot, sweetened coffee. "There's no time for that now," he said, his voice devoid of accusation. "Just get warm." In that moment, the shelter ceased to be his alone. The ark had taken on its first passengers. The great thaw arrived not with a gentle melt but with the groan of a world awakening from a long and terrible fever. Water dripped, then trickled, then poured from every surface, carving channels through the immense walls of snow. When the survivors of Prosperity Creek finally emerged, they squinted into a sunlight that seemed alien and impossibly bright. The valley was scarred and battered, a landscape rearranged by the storm's violent passage, but it was alive. Silas's mine had become a legend. In the final weeks of the winter, he had sheltered nearly a dozen people, the most vulnerable of the town, the children, the elderly, and the sick. He had shared his food, his warmth, and his quiet strength without a word of reproach or a hint of triumph. His vindication was not in their apologies, which came haltingly at first, then in a flood, but in the simple, undeniable fact of their survival. Young Thomas had lived. The community was transformed. The old hierarchies, built on wealth and social standing, had been frozen and shattered. A new respect, forged in shared hardship, had taken its place. Mr. Abernathy, humbled and thinner, approached Silas one morning as he was assessing the damage to his old cabin. He did not offer words. He simply handed Silas a key. "To the store," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Anything you ever need. It's yours." But it was more than supplies that the town now sought from Silas. They came seeking knowledge. They asked about the mine, about the construction of the Quonset, about his understanding of the seasons. That summer, the men of Prosperity Creek did not just rebuild their own homes. Under Silas's guidance, they worked together to expand the shelter within the Sterling mine, reinforcing the structure, adding a second Quonset, and digging a proper well. It was no longer his refuge. It was theirs. It was a testament to the enduring power of foresight and a permanent monument to the winter that had almost broken them. Is it not true that the deepest wisdom is often born from the deepest wounds? For Silas Blackwood, the loss of one life had taught him how to save many. Sitting in Martha's rocking chair at the mouth of the mine, watching his neighbors work together under the warm sun, he felt the hollow space inside him fill, not with sorrow, but with the quiet, resolute peace of a purpose fulfilled.